I am Dean of the USC Price School of Public Policy. Thank you for joining us today for this special extended Price Talks session. Today we'll be discussing the fight for democracy, focusing on redistricting and ensuring voting access in the November election. I am pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. Alex Padilla is the California Secretary of State. He is focused on modernizing the office, increasing voter registration and participation, and strengthening voter rights. He sponsored legislation in 2015 to establish vote centers, expand early voting, and implement same-day conditional voter registration from the Voters' Choice Act. In 2018, he launched the California Motor Voter Program, which automatically registers eligible Californians to vote when they obtain or renew their state ID or driver's license. The program registered 1 million new voters in its first year alone. So welcome, Secretary. Karen Hobart Flynn is the president of Common Cause. She is an effective strategist who knows how to win reforms at all levels of government, strengthening the people's voice in our democracy. Especially in a time of hyperpolarization and the obstruction of progress on important legislation in Congress, Karen is a clear, nonpartisan voice for democracy, unafraid of taking on those who hold power and reminding politicians they work for the people and serve in the public interest. Her roots at Common Cause date back more than 25 years, and she is the organization's 10th president. So welcome, Karen. Christian Grose is the academic director of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy at the Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. He received his PhD in political science and is the author of more than 30 articles and chapters about American politics, redistricting, political representation, including the American Journal of Political Science and the Journal of Politics. So welcome, Christian. Mindy Romero is the founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project at the University of Southern California Price School, located in Sacramento. Mindy is a political sociologist and holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on political behavior and race, ethnicity, and seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in California and the United States. So thank you all for joining us today. And now Mindy will give an overview of today's talk. Mindy?
Thank you very much, Dean Knott. Thank you for joining us and for those wonderful welcoming remarks. Before we begin our discussion today, I'd like to give everyone just a quick run through of our agenda, and I'll direct your attention to the chat function. The agenda should be pasted there, or will be shortly. You'll see that there are two topics that we are focusing on today. Both we think are critical in the fight for our democracy during the time of COVID. The first is redistricting, minority rule, and voting rights, and that will be covered by my colleague, Dr. Christian Grose. He'll be giving an academic presentation, and then of course we'll be hearing from our two esteemed panelists. The second topic is ensuring voter access in the upcoming November elections. I'll be giving a presentation on that topic, and of course, again, we'll hear from both Secretary Padilla and Karen Hobart Flynn. And you'll see from the agenda, our goal, at least, is to end about 1, or hopefully a little before. We actually extended our time today till 1:30, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. From 1 to about 1:30, and I want to make sure everybody's aware of the Q&A feature on your screen. We have disabled the chat just because of security concerns that we all have around online platforms these days. So if you have a question, you can submit it to the Q&A anytime between now and during the Q&A time itself. Harley, who is part of our USC communications team, has wonderfully joined us today. She's actually moderating and facilitating this whole process for us, and she will be reviewing all of those questions and verbally giving those to us and directing them to the appropriate speaker to answer them. So that's our agenda. Before we get started, we have a quick interactive item. We have a poll, which you should be seeing on your screen. We'd like to get a sense of where everybody's at coming to the conversation. We think it's interesting for us, but hopefully for many of you. We have a already over 200 people joining us. I know we had about 500 signed up today. And of course, we have folks on Facebook Live too. But if you're part of the Zoom platform, here's the question. One simple question. Which of the following most concerns you in terms of COVID-19's impact on the November 2020, should say election, November 20 election? You'll see the choices there. You are familiar. You don't have to fill it out, but if you're familiar, go ahead and give us your thoughts. The options are gerrymandering, expanding vote by mail, access to in-person voting, cost of the election, disenfranchisement of historically underrepresented groups, voter fraud, election security and hacking, or something else. And I think there might also be a choice there that you don't have a concern. So we'll just give a moment here for everyone who wants to participate. And Harley, can you give me the thumbs up when we're ready to post those results? Interesting. So the percentage is there. All right. So hopefully you find that interesting, but we're going to go ahead and move on. Thank you very much, Harley, for helping us do that today. I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Christian Grose, who will be talking about redistricting. Christian, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. This is really great, and I'm glad we've got so many people listening. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we've done in the Schwarzenegger Institute, which focuses on political reforms and particularly gerrymandering, redistricting, and primaries. But we did a report last year about minority rule in U.S. state legislatures, and I'm going to highlight some of that. But my first comments are going to focus on COVID-19, potential delays in the census because of that, and impacts that might have on redistricting, especially in state legislatures, opportunities that legislatures will now have to engage in gerrymandering in 2021, 2022 because of that possible delay, and then also voting rights concerns that could arise due to that. So first of all, just want to mention the Schwarzenegger Institute and thank Governor Schwarzenegger, who's a big proponent of independent redistricting commissions, who's worked with, our panelists will be hearing from later, in making the Independent Redistricting Commission happen in California. Here in California, we're going to have an Independent Redistricting Commission for the second time this coming round. And I think that while redistricting can sometimes get kind of in the weeds and you can get a little bit too detailed sometimes, it's really important. And right now we're all focused on coronavirus. We're all focused on our public health. There's a lot of discussion on vote by mail, but we have to keep our eye on the ball about redistricting. So the census is done every 10 years, as you know. It's going on right now. After the census, redistricting is the redrawing of lines for Congress and state legislatures is done after that. It's done at the state level, but it follows the U.S. Census, and each state has different procedures to engage in redistricting. Gerrymandering is when there's some form of redistricting that helps a particular group. Partisan gerrymandering is the best known, something that would help elect Republicans or help elect Democrats. But then there's other forms of gerrymandering too. I do think that as many of you know, the census, the Department of Commerce has announced that they would like to delay the census, which is the count of the number of people in the United States, which is essential to know how many congressional districts we have in each state, which is essential to know how we can divide up districts so that there's one person, there's population equity across districts. But the delay in the census, there's a good public health reason to do that. I'm not here to suggest that we should all go outside right now and start immediately enumerating the census. I'm aware there's a health issue that's important. However, indefinite delays of the census do concern me, and I'm gonna walk through how some of that, why some of that could be concerning. So the Commerce Department has suggested delaying the census for a few months, and if the delay is substantial, it will postpone the ability for most states to draw lines that have to be redrawn for 2022. The lines to elect our members of Congress and the lines to elect our state legislators. The concern that I have is that we know that in states that are not like California, where legislators draw their own lines, legislators are interested in protecting their own parties and helping themselves get reelected. That's just a theoretical assertion in political science and also an empirical reality in the world of politics. If the census is delayed substantially, then right now the census has proposed 120 calendar day delay. Congress has to approve this in order to provide relief. And I don't know what Congress is thinking in that regards right now, but the data collection on the number of people across the country will be delivered much later. Apportionment counts, which means the number of seats. So right now, California has 53 U.S. House seats. That number will be determined typically by December 31st of this year. But with the census's proposal, that will be April 30th. State legislatures, or in California, the commission and other states with commissions would get data to actually redraw their electoral lines in July 31st, 2021, instead of March 31st, 2021. So this is a potential problem because it does create opportunities for especially legislators who want a partisan gerrymander to gerrymander. So one thing I could anticipate that I just want to raise a flag for while all of us are thinking about public health and the coronavirus is that the state legislatures could potentially use other data besides census enumeration to draw lines if there's a census delay. This varies by state. Some of this might be okay. Some of it could be extremely problematic. But there's about slightly more than half of US states allow state legislative lines to be drawn using other data besides the census. Some states explicitly say in their laws, if the census is delayed, other lines could be used. So what I could imagine is, and the last thing I want to mention on a legal standpoint, Supreme Court in the late 1990s stated apportionment, which is the allocation of seats to states for Congress, the federal level, has to be done via a census and enumeration. However, they did say that state legislative districting, it is implied, could be done using other data. And so, and also, depending on how you define the word apportionment, if you take that to mean just literally the allocation of seats to Congress instead of the redrawing of congressional lines, you could make an argument that the redrawing of congressional lines could also use other data. I think that's concerning for a lot of different reasons, but that's something that is basically a question in the current law. So what are the intentions of delay that the Commerce Department is doing? There's a good intention, right? We're in the middle of a public health crisis. We need to do something, but I am concerned there might be more if this goes on for a long time. And so there's a real incentive for a couple things. Legislatures controlled by Democrats in states that have very flexible rules on how they can redraw their state legislative and possibly congressional lines would want to use estimates that would basically make sure there are counts in urban areas that are higher than we typically get in the census. The census itself often undercounts urban areas for a variety of reasons, and the real number is probably higher. I could see Democratic-controlled legislatures who draw their own lines using population-based estimates in order to basically help elect Democrats and also probably get a more accurate population equity number as well. In Republican-controlled legislatures, I could see the opposite. Other estimates that would actually undercount urban areas and would overcount rural areas where there's more Republican strength could be used, again, if there's a census delay. This varies by state. A number of states require census data in their laws for state legislative districting, but a lot of them don't. And so I do think this census proposal could really open the floodgates to a new form of gerrymandering that we haven't really seen. And then also just the last thing that concerns me and I think is worth thinking about, if the census does delay the count and the data go to the states later, it could lead to voting rights violations too. The Voting Rights Act Section 2 is still the law of the land even after Shelby County versus Holder. There are gerrymanders that could be done that would negatively impact minority voting rights, dilute minority voting power, pack minority voters, crack minority voters, especially if different data are being used. There could be equal protection issues across the states and within states and state legislatures. If census data is being used for one map, but some estimates or some other data are being used for another map, that could open up voting rights violations. And then just in general, even for those states that are doing, trying to do good districting with population equity, if the data come really late, there's going to be a rush, and that just creates a potential risk for voting rights violations. And that's something that concerns me too. And so what have we seen in the past? We've seen that states are willing to draw lines when the legislators draw the lines, where they will draw seats to protect their own party, even if that party doesn't get the most votes. One egregious example is Wisconsin in 2018. The party that received a majority of the votes in the state received fewer than 50% of the seats. Another really egregious example is the state of Kentucky. In Kentucky in 2018, about 57% of the vote in the state went to Republicans, but Republicans got about 90% of the seats in the state. But there are many examples of that. I wrote a report on it for the Schwarzenegger Institute. I'm happy to provide that link to people who are interested if you want to email me, where we go through and identified this past decade's worst gerrymanders and then the best redistricting. And you can see the states like Wisconsin and Kentucky and North Carolina and Michigan that were the worst in this past decade. But I do have concerns that we have a new form of gerrymander that could arise due to the delays in the census. So with that, I want to open it up to Karen and Alex, Secretary Padilla and President Flynn, to take some questions on this topic and also offer their general reactions on the topic of redistricting. Both of you have done a lot of important work on election reform, redistricting in particular, and so I'm really interested to hear your perspective. So my first question is, what is your reaction to the Department of Commerce's request to delay the census? In particular, how do you think the delay of the several months will impact redistricting, either in California, in case of Secretary Padilla, or across the country?
First, it's an honor to be here, and I want to thank the USC Price School of Public Policy for hosting this, as well as the Schwarzenegger Institute. So I think I'm not surprised by poll numbers that we took, that people are really interested in these issues. And I want to say that, we are committed to a fair and accurate count for the census for all communities, particularly those that have been marginalized and historically missed in the past. And we're monitoring these changes in the Census Bureau. We understand the need for a delay to ensure the door-to-door enumeration is effective and is, in particular, counting these undercounted communities. We need to ensure that the Census Bureau, one, is working with Congress and is transparent about their plans, how they spend their money, and the progress that's being made. Plans to delay in-person counting for several months means they need to do more to encourage self-response in hard-to-count communities by sending more mailings and running more advertisements. We are not where we need to be with 51% of households that have already responded to this census. If you look at 2010, the number was around 65.5%. So we have a ways to go, and it's very important. And my guess is, if we were to look at the households that have responded, many may not include people of color, immigrants, children, impoverished people, and others that are hard to reach. So an incomplete non-response follow-up operation would mean a failed 2020 census. So there's a couple things we don't know. Some things we're also keeping a watch on. One is, we don't know if people will be confused about how to answer the census in October, about what their situation was on April 1st. On April 1st, you could have had your sons home from college and you had your mother-in-law visiting so you could watch her during the pandemic. What does that mean for October when everybody's moved out? Given also the COVID-19 crisis, we don't know when the census can restart field operations. We know what they hope to do, but we need to seriously examine contingency plans for the Census Bureau if they're unable to resume field operations by June of 2020. We also don't know if census responses will be deemed so unreliable that some states will try to use this as an excuse to inject their own data into the mix to carry out redistricting, as you talked about, Christian. So we will be watching for states that will use the delayed release of census data to postpone redistricting until 2023 or 2024. Frankly, if party insiders are holding on to power through gerrymandered lines, the extra 2 years could be enough time for them to pass restrictive voting laws, eviscerate the checks and balances of courts, weaken the governor's power if they're not of the same party, or rig other levers of government to give themselves an electoral advantage. Frankly, this was the playbook of states like North Carolina, where partisan operatives delayed court-ordered redistricting for a year and pushed through restrictive voter ID laws during that time. We also know 7 states have elections in 2021 or early 2022. So a state like Texas that had its primary scheduled for March of 2022 could announce that it will delay redistricting until 2023. Second, we will be watching the states that have redistricting deadlines embedded in their state constitutions or laws. So 17 states have deadlines that will have to be changed if the Census Bureau delays giving states redistricting data until July 31st of 2021. So we're on the lookout for states that may use the COVID crisis to issue executive orders or adopt laws that change these states and slip in changes to limit redistricting to citizens who are 18 years or older. Why is that bad? For nearly a century, we've drawn district lines based on total population to ensure that every person has representation in the halls of power and the ability to be counted. And finally, I'll say that in 2018, we uncovered a partisan plot to rig redistricting by basing it only on voting age citizens and not total population. As part of our North Carolina redistricting case, Common Cause v. Lewis, we obtained the hard drives from Stephanie Hoffler, who had drives that contains maps and analysis and other data from her father, Thomas Hoffler, who was the Republican Party's gerrymandering expert. In his secret documents, he laid out how removing Americans who are not 18 years old or citizens from the census data that they would use to redistrict would be advantageous to Republicans and white voters. So we also know he worked to get a citizen question added to the census in order to collect citizenship data so that states could use voting age population to benefit Republicans. So while some might think this seems far-fetched, news outlets are reporting in the last week in Missouri that the state legislators are planning to come into a special session, even though there's a health pandemic, to move a constitutional amendment to the ballot that would undo some of the redistricting reforms passed in 2018, and that would also allow population counts for maps to exclude non-citizens and children. So this is something we have to look at and is really troubling. And I also think we will also have to look at states that have adopted new and fair redistricting processes like Colorado or Michigan, just to be sure that shortened time periods to draw new lines could jeopardize time for real public input from communities so that we can be protecting communities of interest. So I'll leave it with that, but many of the same concerns you have.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, well, you guys covered a whole lot between Dr. Grose and Karen. I'll try to just fill in some tidbits that are pertinent for California specifically, but let me just begin by saying thank you to the Price School for pulling all this together. It's how we power through despite the stay-at-home orders and everything else that we're grappling with. I trust that everybody on this call, not just the panelists, but everybody watching and listening in is staying safe and healthy and washing their hands constantly, because that's what it's going to take for us to get to the other side of the flattening the curve dynamic. I see a lot of parallels, and so it's not a coincidence that we'll be discussing the COVID impact on elections, but as it pertains to the census and therefore the reapportionment and redistricting process by extension, because they're both so fundamental to our democracy and sadly have become increasingly political and partisan. We've always known the census is important. We didn't go through the ABCs here, but it's a census data that drives federal funding formulas, not just for every state, but for every community in each state, funding for public health, for education, for infrastructure, housing, etc. But because it drives the reapportionment process and fuels the redistricting process, unfortunately, it has become a target for political manipulation. We don't have to speculate. Look at the proposal to question the citizenship of every person in America that we were successful in fighting off. That was a proposed question by the Trump administration to be added to the census, knowing full well that it would have discouraged or intimidated people from participating. So when you skew the data like that, you undermine the integrity of the reapportionment process, the ability to redistrict as well. And so whether it's that or the impact of a delay. So, I mean, I think the original question was, what do I think of the potential delay? It's a little bit mixed, I'll be honest. I mean, on the surface, you think, well, it's a great recognition of if not just census enumerators cannot be out there doing the field work necessary to get us to as close to a fair and complete count as possible, but also look at California, $187 million investment in census outreach and education. It starts with traditional and social media advertising campaigns, but investment by region with so many community organizations, local leaders, nonprofits, and others to do the outreach, to do the assistance for people to participate. All that has ground to a halt because of COVID-19. So if a delay is entertained with the true intention of, okay, let's just buy ourselves a little bit of time so we can do this right, that'd be one thing. But unfortunately, and I know we're not getting too partisan or political on this call, but it is what it is. You know, everything is suspect under this presidential administration. And so when I hear it in an Oval Office briefing, that there's a delay under consideration, you got to ask yourself, why? What's in it for them? How's it going to hurt me, particularly as a Californian? Because states like California, New York, states with large populations, diverse populations, have been under the gun for the last 4 years. And by virtue of what the census is all about, we also have the most at stake because of our large, historically hard to count communities, right? In California, if you look at the hard to count criteria, people of color, immigrants, young people, lower income families, all historically harder to count. That's more than 70% of the people in California. So we have a lot at stake through the redistricting process, which means the census is even that much more critical for what we have to do. So I think for the short term, you know, we have to operate under the current timelines. There has been no delay, there has been no extension. And so just as we're keeping up with our coworkers, our family members, our friends, our neighbors via phone call, via email, via Zoom video conferences and the like, let's make sure we're integrating, have you done your census, have you done your census, have you done your census, into all those conversations. You know, Karen mentioned that compared to 10 years ago, California's response rate to date is lagging a little bit. So that's not encouraging, but we are over the 50% mark. Last I checked, California's at about 52%, which is a couple of points ahead of the national average. So that's a little encouraging, but a big reminder that we have a lot more work to do. The more we can get people to do this by phone or online, whereas those paper forms are hitting, the less reliant we'll be on what will be the field work done at whatever point in time. But I think as every day goes by and the curve hasn't flattened and the physical distancing requirements may still be in place and a challenge to work around, we're inching towards a greater likelihood of a potential delay, which, you know, you start looking state by state, who's got majorities baked in, either legislatively or through their congressional delegations, is not necessarily the best thing.
Okay, great. I want to ask both of you one more question, and then I'm going to pass it over to Professor Romero to talk about vote by mail and continue the conversation there. But for Secretary Padilla, could you talk about what is California doing to ensure fairness in redistricting, you know, in the second go round, and then for Karen, thinking ahead, both in California and then in other states in general, where is the vanguard of reform? What state should we be looking at for doing the right things, and is one of those California?
Yeah. So for California, I think the best thing that we could do to ensure a fair redistricting has been done, and that's you know, by a vote of the people. The redistricting process has been taken out of the hands of the legislature and placed into an independent commission that's driven by the state auditor of all folks. So the process of putting that commission in place has begun, and you know, it worked out pretty well. Most people give it pretty good reviews from the 2010 the 2011 experience, but independent or not, it's still reliant on quality data from the census. So the two have to go hand in hand.
Great. First, I want to say thank you to Secretary of State Alex Padilla. First, California is a model for the nation. And when we're looking at both who has passed reform and states that are looking to move reform, California continues to be a model that people want to emulate. So, we have seen 17 states that have passed some form of redistricting. Reforms range from fully independent commissions to politician commissions that require balanced partisanship and strong constitutional standards that have been enforced effectively in state court. 7 states have independent citizen redistricting commissions with bipartisan balance, and California created the first one. And it's been a model for states like Michigan and Colorado, who just enacted their reform in 2018. So we had 5 states pass redistricting reform in 2018, which was remarkable. And interestingly enough, before COVID added the challenge of gathering signatures in a timely manner, there was a strong possibility that reformers were going to match or top the record of 2018. There were citizen activists in red and blue states like Arkansas, Oklahoma, Oregon, Nebraska, Nevada, North Dakota, and Virginia launching efforts to pass ballot initiatives to stop gerrymandering. Innovative as ever, these champions are looking for creative ways to gather signatures digitally or by mail. I know one state, Oregon, which is a vote by mail state, has a voter-friendly law where people can download petitions, sign it, and mail that in. So they're not giving up. And it is a left-right coalition with strong support from Common Cause, the Farm Bureau, the League of Women Voters, the Chamber of Commerce to move reform there. In Virginia, the reform community scored an impressive win when years of pressure and activism allowed them to do a rare passage through the legislature. So they're sending a historic constitutional amendment on reform to the ballot this November. So, to me, states are not going to give up on reform and will also be using tools to watch citizen and do citizen mapping processes when we get around to drawing district lines, and also litigation if necessary.
All right, thank you. The last thing I just want to mention related to that reminded me of something. So the Schwarzenegger Institute is really interested in trying to find solutions to issues in election reform in general, but especially during the time of coronavirus. And one of those is ballot signatures, right? There are a number of robust initiative states, California included, where it's difficult to do initiatives. Karen was talking about states like Oregon and elsewhere. If there's anyone interested in supporting efforts to try to figure out how to do ballot signatures during the time of COVID, please reach out to me. I'm working on hoping to do some research on that, and of course reach out to Karen on Common Cause's side for their particular initiatives in the states that she mentioned. All right, thank you both, Secretary Padilla and Karen. I'm going to pass it over to Professor Romero for the next part of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grose. Before I jump in on my topic, I would like to draw everybody's attention to the chat feature. We have posted, Harley kindly has posted everyone's Twitter handles. So our esteemed panelists, myself, and Dr. Grose's. So I'm going to talk to you about ensuring voter access in the upcoming November election, but let me set the stage a little bit first. So of course, we are all now experiencing the impact of COVID in our daily lives. Every policy area in our society is impacted by COVID, and election policy, putting on an election is no exception. So what we know now, our current modeling from the top health experts in the country are telling us that we're likely to see some sort of significant effect from COVID in November. Whether it's a continuation of the effects that we're seeing now, or whether there's a wave and a resurgence in the fall, we're going to probably see some sort of effect. Or at least we have to plan as if we are. And we know that election officials across the country in every state are doing just that. They're having to plan for the very real possibility that they will not be able to put on a status quo election. And because they plan months in advance, Even if we end up being very fortunate and aren't as impacted by COVID in November, they have to plan now for that possibility and that reality. So we know that there is a concern around the safety, right, of in-person voting. Actually, things like social distancing, personal protective equipment, how do we actually get voters through without potentially risking their health and their lives. There also, though, is the reality of being able to just staff and put on an in-person election aside from the impacts on voters. So we're hearing from election officials in California and across the country also that those volunteer poll workers and locations are pulling back on their commitments because of concerns around COVID. So all of that means that November is a real challenge, right, to even put on an election. At the same time, we have to put on an election. There will be an election in November. At least we are working under that assumption on this talk today. Only Congress can change that possibility of an election, can change the date, and the calendar window for such a change is incredibly narrow because the Constitution, of course, requires that, at least on the presidential level, we inaugurate a president in January. So we're going to work under that assumption. So we have to put on an election. How do we ensure an accessible, robust election in the time of COVID? So first, let me just take a moment out to say why it even matters. So we know that in any given election, whether it's a midterm, presidential, low turnout, high turnout, we don't have a representative electorate, period, in this country and in any state, including California, with all the great work that's been done in California as a model in many respects. The makeup of all voters in an election doesn't match the makeup of the population itself. And if we look by race, ethnicity, age, income, educational status, pretty much you name it, the pie of voters is not representative of the population. So there are great disparities in turnout that create the disparities in the makeup of the population. So we're starting at that point. So if we see reduced turnout, every vote matters, period, right? But also reduced turnout, a great concern is that we could actually see a widening of those disparities that are already present, which has significant concerns, impacts on, of course, voice, representation, policy choices, particularly in a time of COVID. So I want to set the stage with that. So turnout matters, representation matters. So one solution, if we're talking about safety, is vote by mail. It's not 100%, but it is a safer option, much safer option than voting in person. I'm going to talk a little bit about vote by mail, but I want to note, as I will discuss a little later, that we're not talking about vote by mail by itself. We are talking about expanding vote by mail, the importance of that, while also still providing robust, accessible, in-person options for voters. And again, I'll talk about that in a moment, but first, vote by mail. So a quarter of Americans already use vote by mail. We have 5 states that are essentially all vote by mail, or at least they mail their ballots. All registered voters get a vote by mail ballot in the mail. Those are Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, brand new this year, Utah, and Colorado. All of those states offer still some sort of in-person voting, particularly Colorado, but the vast majority of the population is using an in-person ballot. Using a vote by mail ballot, either mailing it or dropping it off at a location. Aside from that, though, we have a number of other states where a majority of ballots cast are vote by mail ballots. California being one of them, we're at about 2/3 of our state as a whole that use vote by mail ballots. Also Arizona, Montana, New Mexico. But then when we look across the United States, there's great variation in the use by voters of vote by mail, and very much so in the accessibility of vote by mail. So we have 1/3 of all states roughly, where voters have to have an excuse. They have to not only request their vote by mail ballot, but they have to have a reason stated for requesting that vote by mail ballot, making it much less accessible, right? And it results in, across the United States, very big differences. We have a number of states that I think actually it's close to 30 states, 27 states, where the use of vote by mail of voters is below 10%. So below 10% of voters casting ballots they're using a vote by mail ballot. And in some states, in the very low single digits, right? So there's great variation in the use, but also certainly in the policies, which I'll talk about. Allowing voters to vote by mail, making sure that every registered voter can get a vote by mail ballot is important. If it's not automatic, then at least they should be able to get it without having to go to a lot to be able to request it, right? We know that from data, voters also need options around dropping off that vote by mail ballot. There are a number, always a percentage of voters that have concerns around the vote by mail process. Here in California, we conducted research at the CCEP back in 2016, a representative statewide survey, and we identified that of voters that didn't mail their ballot, so they either used a vote by mail ballot, but they wanted to drop it off in person, or they voted in person at a traditional polling place or vote center, 27% of them said they didn't use the mail because they didn't trust the USPS to be able to get it there safely and their ballot counted. And there are also significant differences by race, ethnicity, so and other statuses as well, but just race, ethnicity, we knew that was higher, that distrust number, that percent was higher for Latinos, even higher for African Americans, and very high, 47% for Asian Americans. So concerns around the mail process and also differences in the degree of those concerns. Moving on from that, you know, we're talking about vote by mail, making it as universal as possible. But I want to be clear that mail only is not a panacea. Number one, it would be, I think, highly unlikely that we would see, because of those differences across the state, from both voters' familiarity and use, but also on the side of policy and also on the side of election officials and jurisdictions, having very little capacity, many of them, right, to process lots of vote by mail ballots. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see all jurisdictions across the United States move to all vote by mail. And if we did, that would not be a good thing. So we would likely see, if we went to all vote by mail and only mailing as an option, I think the data tell us that we could very well be facing a possibility of having hundreds of thousands, if not millions of voters potentially disenfranchised. Of course, that depends on the impact of COVID as well, but we'll just state that. So not mail only, vote by mail with robust in-person options. A little bit more about our research. So here in California, we have done a number of studies around how voters use their options, right? Why they choose vote by mail, why they choose to vote in person. And we know that there are also disparities, differences by race, ethnicity, and other statuses in terms of the percentages that use vote by mail. So for instance, Latinos and young voters age 18 to 24, for the last 2 decades and currently now, because our studies go back 2 decades, use vote by mail in lower percentages. There are real reasons why some voters use vote by mail and others still use in person, and particularly for historically underrepresented groups. So reasons like, certainly we know the in-person social aspect is very important to voters, historically significant for many communities. Of course, what COVID does to that, right, that could change, but also familiarity and comfort in vote by mail. Understanding if you're going to use a vote by mail ballot, many communities that don't have that experience are hesitant, are fearful of making a mistake, of using that process, don't have the information fully to be able to actually execute that option. We also know that voters that go in person other than the social aspect, also because maybe they have questions. They want to make sure that they've signed it in the right spot, that they've filled out that ballot appropriately with nobody influencing their answer, but just that they've appropriately filled it out, the process of it. They may have questions and needs around language access. They have to go in person for that. Voters with disabilities needing to and wanting to use an accessible voting machine. So there are many reasons. Also, there can be mistakes sometimes in vote by mail. Maybe somebody didn't receive their ballot, their address didn't get updated. The only way only real way in real time to be able to fix those issues on election day is to be able to go in person, at least for most voters. So real reasons why people use in person and disproportionate, right, use. I think that's all important to talk about. And we will, by the way, should have said this at the outset, we are going to, Harley's going to kindly post this talk, the recording, and all of the research that we're talking about, the links to all of the research on the site's webpage. So you'll be able to go there, I think by tonight or tomorrow, and be able to get all of those links. So moving on here. Oh, also lastly, we also know that there are differences in rejection rates. Vote by mail ballots do go through a very rigorous process to be verified, signature verifications, and there are disparities. We've identified, at least in California and a few other states, disparities in how, in the rates, the likelihood somebody's ballot could be rejected. Very, very small, but it does occur, and it disproportionately occurs across by race, ethnicity, and so forth. And then also the funding. So anytime you have a historic change around voting, or if anytime you have a change period, a new election reform, we know that some voters are not going to get that message. Many voters might not get that message. And this time of COVID, this fundamental change of moving to vote by mail and whatever changes exactly happen, the limitations are potentially around in-person voting, voters are going to need that information. They're going to need to get it in a way that they trust it, they feel confident in it, that they don't feel like it's political maneuvering or something to, to discount their participation. And we know from much research in the field that historically underrepresented voters that of color, younger voters, voters that are first-time voters, new voters, infrequent voters, are much less likely to get that information, to get that messaging, whether it's from campaigns or candidates, but also from their election official, their voter guide, if you will. So we talk about making these changes across the country, and we say, well, we'll educate folks and we'll get the word out and we'll do public messaging. We know not everybody will get the message. And we also don't know the quality of those messages, if they will resonate, if they will feel salient, if people will trust them. And we also don't know what the funding will be around that outreach campaign. We can have a robust outreach campaign that has the right messages, that is well thought through, but maybe the funding isn't there. So we have to be realistic as we talk about changes, how much we really can reach out to groups and be able to connect with groups around these changes. It's got to be done, but we have to be realistic about it. So the challenges around expanding vote by mail, just a few more things here to make sure we're clear. We said we need to expand vote by mail for all the reasons I've already stated, but the current capacity of election jurisdictions across the country, again, varies very much. And they're going to need funding. They're going to need to build things into their timeline, like relationships with their printers around ballots. What is their capacity to be able to get all those ballots out to the voters accurately and efficiently? What is their capacity on the back end to be able to process? Do they have optical scanners to process quickly those vote by mail ballots? Do they have the facility size to process, to store those vote by mail ballots, things like that? We're also going to need additional time, likely, as we see a big ramp up in the use of vote by mail, to whatever degree. We may be seeing additional time that's needed for states to finish and certify their election. They're going to need additional resources and time. So in California, it seems like the last few elections we get, and I know Secretary Padilla knows this, we become the butt of jokes. People wonder why it takes so long for California to count all its ballots. Well, it takes us a long time because we have a lot of vote by mail ballots, as you heard, about 2/3. But also we're making sure that every single ballot is being processed appropriately, being verified. That's a good thing that it takes us a while. But we surely will see, as we see a ramp up, at least in some jurisdictions across the country, additional time that is needed. Potentially that means that Congress might have to step in and change some of the laws around when the electors meet for the Electoral College. But we need to be realistic about the processing time. And lastly, I want to say that political maneuvering is also a challenge when we talk about expanding vote by mail. We saw what happened in Wisconsin with the Republican state lawmakers there, forcing the in-person experience, not delaying the voting period, the primary itself. We've heard, unfortunately, our President Trump talk about his great dislike of vote by mail, his distrust of vote by mail, saying that he feels that it's rampant with fraud and political advantage. The data show us, research study after research study, and this is understood by Republicans and Democrats alike across the country, elected officials and advocates, that voter fraud is incredibly rare, including still vote by mail. That is not an issue, and we have no established partisan disadvantage for Republicans or partisan advantage, period, as well. So that is important. That should not be part of the conversation. And the reason why I highlight it as a disadvantage is that we know that that conversation by the president or others, whoever, just those claims around voter fraud, can be used as reasoning or excuse in some states as they expand to maybe not expand as much, or to put limits on the access to vote by mail that could disproportionately impact historically underrepresented groups. So that's very important that we track that and understand that. And then just in closing, again, widely accessible vote by mail is a no-brainer with robust in-person voting options. Congress needs to fund all of this, the outreach and the administrative side of it, that we can't lose sight of. And lastly, the decisions election officials make across the country, are making now across the country, are going to have great impacts on potentially the size of turnout, but very importantly, the makeup of our electorate, as access could be disproportionately disadvantaged. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over now. I've got a few questions for our esteemed panel. Move over to that. So this first question is both for Secretary Padilla and Karen Hobart Flynn. I'll ask the Secretary to go first on this one. Secretary Padilla, what do you think is the greatest challenge facing states right now in ensuring full access to the ballot box?
How much time do we got? Well, the good news on this one is not only am I obviously well versed in what's happening here in California and how we're preparing for November, but since the outbreak of COVID-19 and early March, really, I've been in touch constantly with a lot of my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, throughout the country, because California, thankfully, was past our presidential primary election. We were part of Super Tuesday. And while that didn't get us out of the woods, right? We're in the middle of the canvass period, processing all the ballots, finishing our ballot counting, post-election audits, et cetera. There was other states that were seeking to learn from our experiences. They're working towards their primary, which is upon us, right? We have a little bit more than 6 months for November, but for many states, they're getting ready for their primaries still. So I've had the benefit of a lot of that engagement, a lot of those conversations. And I think the most helpful thing for everybody is to remember this perspective, this historical context. Throughout our nation's history, voters have gone to the polls on election day, whether it's been in times of peace, whether it's been in times of war, whether it's been in good economic times, or whether it's been times of economic recession. Even during the Great Depression, Americans went to vote. And even during the flu pandemic of 1918, the election went forward. So when it comes to the election, it is not a matter of if there will be a November general election. It is not a matter of when there will be a November general election. There is a date, Tuesday, November 3rd. The question is, how will we administer the election that is accessible, as always, secure, as always, but now also safe from a public health standpoint for everybody involved, for voters, to poll workers, and elections staff alike. And as we've tried to go back to the drawing board and see what would be the ideal setup for November, in California, it turns out that a lot of the policies that we put in place to increase access to the ballot for all eligible citizens make even more sense during a health pandemic. Even before we get to vote, you got to register first, right? So whether it's been the benefit of automatic registration through DMV over the last couple of years, or the ability for anybody to register or update their registration online, no more physically distancing safe way to do that than to do it online. When it comes to voting, like, you're absolutely right. California has a lot of experience with vote by mail. It's growing in popularity. You mentioned about 2/3. Get this, in our primary election, more than 75% of California voters received their ballot in the mail because of people signing up, because of many counties transitioning to the Voters' Choice Act. And so for us to go from 75 to as close to 100 as we can get is a lot easier than going from 0 to 100. still a lot of work. That last 25%, you're talking about 5 million voters. But the driving philosophy for our planning and preparation is, if we get as many people as possible to vote early, whether it is by mail or whether it is safely in person, that's going to mean slightly reduced lines and smaller crowds on election day. And that's going to be better for everybody from a wait time standpoint, from a public health standpoint, et cetera. But I couldn't agree more. One, expand vote by mail to the best of our ability, but we have to preserve the in-person options for folks who prefer it. I think that's their right. We have to do it safely. For folks who need some sort of assistance, whether it's a simple, replacement ballot or language assistance or accessibility issues, even though we now have remote accessible vote by mail or any of those things. So thankfully, California's got a lot of the infrastructure in place. It's a matter of how we scale up county by county to that model. A lot of other states don't. And you covered all the high points, whether it's very limited access to voting by mail, if any at all, those sorts of things. I mean, Alabama, it just baffles me. Their voter ID law doesn't just apply to the polling place, by the way. If you want to vote by mail in Alabama, if you're lucky enough to, be qualified for that, you have to insert a copy of your ID in with your ballot in the return envelope, right? So there's a lot that we can do state by state to maintain the integrity of our elections, but at the same time, make it easier for every eligible American to participate. There's a playbook. If you look at what Brennan Center has proposed, the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights, other organizations in this space, to expand vote by mail, to offer in-person early voting opportunities, plus election day, and online registration in states that don't have it, you're talking about a $2 billion investment nationally. So that's what we were sort of advocating for in the last stimulus package, because nothing is more fundamental to our country than our democracy. So the good news is there was a line item of $400 million, not nearly enough helpful, but not nearly enough. And unfortunately, no policy, mandates or even incentives for how to invest this money. So our advocacy at the federal level continues, because there's going to be another round of relief, another round of stimulus. But thankfully, here in California, the state has been a tremendous partner in investing, policies individually, whether it's early voting, online registration, automatic registration, et cetera, but also voter education. Half the voters of the state already live under the Voters' Choice Act, so they're getting their ballot in the mail automatically. They have the options of returning it by mail, drop boxes, or vote centers. So that's the model we're going to seek to grow on for the other counties this November. And before I turn it over, let me just echo one of the observations you made about the need for poll workers. Historically, we've relied on a lot of seniors and retirees as our election day workforce. And now maybe they're a little bit more reluctant, or they're going to be under more stay-at-home orders because of their vulnerabilities. So we have to the extent that we can maintain those in-person options, we're going to be dependent on two things: working collectively to recruit that next generation of poll workers between now and November, but also to identify new locations that are going to be better suited for polling places and vote centers, right? We're not going to see polling places at retirement homes anymore, for example. That doesn't make sense. So we've got to find new locations without disenfranchising folks who live in retirement homes, but whether it's different types of locations, larger locations. If you have gone to vote in a polling place that had maybe 30 voting booths all side by side, now we've got to spread them out 6 feet apart or more. So you're talking just the square footage of a location being fundamentally different than what we've been used to in the past. So put your thinking caps on. If you have locations to suggest, maybe right on the USC campus, there's room for a couple, but also through your networks, through your organizations, through the company or organization you work for, and your circle of friends. If you have folks that are willing to serve their country by putting on a mask, putting on gloves, lathering on hand sanitizer, and doing what it takes to stay safe to help administer the election, we're going to need that call to action for November.
Thank you very much, Secretary Padilla. You answered the second question I have for you too, so that's great. Karen, please jump in and let me know if you'd like me to repeat the question.
Yeah, no problem. First, I agree with your comments, Dr. Romero, and with Secretary Padilla's comments. A few things that I would add. First, before we were hit with the COVID crisis, which really has not only impacted our day-to-day lives, but has impacted our primaries, as we've seen in real time with Ohio's being canceled, with Wisconsin's real mess. The fact is, we were dealing with other challenges with our elections, with widespread voter suppression in the last decade and the ongoing threat of foreign interference in our elections. So in a lot of ways, we already had our hands full before the coronavirus crisis struck. Now states are really racing to adapt their election infrastructure to our new reality. And we're working at Common Cause across the country with state and local officials to ensure these changes are equitable and inclusive. And I agree that moving to 100% vote by mail, as some have proposed, would lead to widespread disenfranchisement of many communities that already face high barriers to vote, including Native Americans, people with disabilities, college students, and people who move frequently, and also those who have limited access to postal service, like those in densely packed urban communities and remote rural areas. Since each state has different capacities and needs, we're advocating for tailored state-specific combinations of increased vote by mail, extended early voting, and safe in-person election day voting for those who need it. I mean, one challenge is that we have learned from the Colorados and Californias, so much of this work to move to vote by mail and vote centers and drop-off boxes that are looking at communities so that people have access, it took time and careful planning, some of which we really don't have in this tight timeline. Also, as Secretary Padilla said, we absolutely need resources from the federal government to ensure that states can move many of these reforms. The other thing I will say is it's interesting to look, there's a new poll that came out by NBC and Wall Street Journal today that show that 68% of Americans believe voters should be able to cast their vote by mail this fall, which is remarkable and speaks to or speaks against those who assert that this is something that only Democrats want to see. Reforms like these have moved in blue and red states with bipartisan support and is very important. Another thing, though, we have to think about as we're looking at vote by mail is that some states, as Secretary Padilla pointed out with Alabama, impose barriers to vote by mail, which can disenfranchise voters. So there's witness and notarization requirements like we saw in Wisconsin, submitting photocopies of their IDs, ballot application impediments, postage requirements, exact signature matches, and many more. And in fact, African Americans are 2 to 3 times more likely than whites to have their ballots rejected. So we need to ensure that any measures moving forward do not have these restrictive measures, and we also need to push for them to be removed or fight them through litigation in states that currently have them. So just this week, a legal case in Michigan was settled around signature verification on absentee applications and ballots when Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, actually who is a former chair of Common Cause, I just want to give a shout out to her, she adopted formal signature match training, uniform standards and procedures for reviewing signatures and notifying voters in a timely way about any concerns of a mismatch, and also offered a cure procedure that give people real time to take care of these problems and make sure their ballot can count. So, you know, when we're looking at this, it's important that we're not adding restrictions on top of all of the issues that Mindy raised in her discussion. And then finally, I will say that we still face some of the other problems that we had in the elections, one of which is the fear of foreign interference in our elections. And we've been at Common Cause on the forefront on fighting for election integrity and pushing for policies that would ensure that voters could mark paper ballots either by hand or assisted devices, and that they can be prompted to review their ballot before casting them. These ballots are not digital or altered in a cyber attack. And the good news about vote by mail is we're talking about paper ballots here. And so therefore, it eliminates a threat presented by paperless electronic voting machines. However, even though we're going through a pandemic, I don't think we can expect nation state actors to not attack our elections. And so I think the danger becomes, as states are quickly moving to vote by mail systems, and they may be quickly developing these systems to access statewide voter databases from polling places like, via either electronic poll books or building or adapting online voter registration systems to accommodate absentee ballot requests. They need to be very careful when they're doing them, that they are working with states like California that think about and look at this, with DHS and others to utilize best practices to protect their databases, and also create recovery and resilience plan for attacks on these systems. And then finally, I'll say we are seeing some states look at the possibility of internet voting. And I just want to say that the use of any internet or voting app system, states should refrain from them because these systems are currently inherently insecure. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Karen. So I think because of time, we are going to go ahead and move on, but I think both of you answered the next questions that we had for you anyway, so that's great. So we're going to open it up to the Q&A. Thank our speakers again very much, Karen Flynn and Secretary Padilla.
Hey, Mindy, as you do that, can I just make a plug for our website, vote.ca.gov. I've been tracking some of the questions in the queue. A lot of the basic questions are easily answered on our elections page. Easy to find, vote.ca.gov for online registration, re-registration, verifying your registration status, how vote by mail works, all of those sorts of things. So it's a great resource. Bookmark it on your phone.
Thank you. And I'll make sure it's linked on our page as well after we post today's session.
Great.
So I'm going to start questions. We've gotten quite a few. I'm going to say them generically, and then please feel free to jump in. I've changed the viewing so that you are all seen on the screen now. So the first question, the Census Bureau has not released any guidance on how local offices should protect their employees and the community from its employees who have tested positive for COVID. Community members, including census employees, deserve protection. If people do not trust the census to keep them safe, that an accurate census is at risk. How can we ensure that the community's legitimate concerns about a reasonable delay of census operations due to COVID-19 are not overshadowed by polarizing politics and negligence on part of the top census officials? And are there options to delay redistricting and voting in concert with a delay in the census?
Well, I'll just chime in just quickly. Again, there hasn't been an official announcement or decision to delay the census. And I'm sure that's not going to be an easy one if they truly consider it. As far as how census workers and others are going to do the outreach, I had a similar question about, well, there's some states that have stay-at-home orders, some that don't, some that had it and are trying to reopen. It's not just federal guidelines that need to be abided by, meaning Center for Disease Control, but state public health directives and local public health directives. So it may not be the Census Bureau telling their field staff what they can or cannot do, but they do have to abide by all federal, state, and local directives that may apply. So for all practical purposes, field operations across the country have come to a halt.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, this is a little bit out of my expertise, but in terms of the need to get the numbers right? If there is no protection, the logic behind that, if there is no protection of census workers, people are fearful of opening their doors. There is possibilities of leaving packets on people's doors who haven't answered the census, similar to a package being delivered and the package person walking away from the people. That's one potential option. But in general, if there's a severe undercount, because of fears of the health crisis, that could lead to states like California having less congressional districts than they probably otherwise would have had there been a full and complete count. And so that's just a concern. And then if the census is delayed or redistricting is delayed, that's problematic from a voting rights ground. We're already 10 years out where populations have shifted dramatically. Certain states like Utah have grown significantly. Their districts are much larger in population than some other states that have not gained in the same level, and that would be a potential equal protection problem and a violation of the Constitution of not having a census, but also equal protection of different populations across states and congressional districts. So redistricting, while something academics and practitioners care about, is really, really important and probably can't be delayed in any serious way.
Okay, I'm going to jump around some questions. For those questions that we do not get to answer today, we are keeping these questions. We will be happy to answer them and have them posted after the session ends. So, if the fight for democracy continues during our pandemic, what are we going to do to empower our most vulnerable populations, such as our homeless, disabled, and undocumented communities?
I'll let her
For starters, just a reminder that when it comes to the census, everybody needs to be counted. Everybody deserves to be counted. Everybody must be counted. The census is not just for citizens. It's not just for voters. It's not just for adults. It's for everybody. So make sure that's abundantly clear to everybody participating here today. And when it comes to voting, I get the question asked a lot. People experiencing homelessness are allowed to register and to vote. You don't need a precise postal mailing address to register to vote, just a description of where you tend to reside. A lot of people who experience homeless use, whether it's a shelter or a food bank, address for receiving their mail, including a vote by mail ballot. But it also underscores the need for in-person options for folks who need it or prefer it.
Okay, I'll keep going. What impact is the absence of prison gerrymandering have on minority communities, since this is California's first cycle not counting prisoners in areas where they are incarcerated, but rather count them where they live?
I mean, so the prison gerrymandering is a new issue, and it's been used. I'm more familiar with it in a few other states. I know other states have used prisons previously to run up numbers in rural areas to have very few voters, even though the number of prisoners are all in one place. I think by distributing people who are currently imprisoned into their original home would make that less easy for people to do, for gerrymandering to do around prisons.
I'll keep going. It sounds like gerrymandering has some serious issues with corruption. I remember there being a Supreme Court case related to this. Why is it still allowed, other than the obvious, which is that it helps certain folks in power? Are there any benefits to keeping this method of redistricting intact?
So on redistricting, one court case that someone may have been talking about is the Common Cause v. Rucho case, where we brought to the Supreme Court egregious partisan gerrymander on the part of the North Carolina legislature. And the court unfortunately ducked the issue. I felt like they left North Carolinians without an answer. They ducked it by saying it really isn't their job to be looking at whether people have fair representation. And instead, they kicked it back to the states, actually, and said, this could be a lawsuit that is brought looking at the state constitution and whether the state constitution understands that people have a state constitutional right to fair representation. And interestingly enough, in North Carolina, we did bring a lawsuit around the state legislative maps in the Common Cause v. Lewis case I mentioned earlier, and won, and new maps have been redrawn. And there was another lawsuit challenging the congressional maps, and that case won, and there are new congressional maps. So for the first time in almost 10 years, North Carolinians have a chance in 2020 to vote under fair maps. Secondly, the Supreme Court highlighted the fact that people can go to the ballot to pass reform like independent redistricting commissions. Now, whether they believe or not in those, The fact that they highlighted that also shows another path for us to have fair represented districts, and that is through moving reform like we're seeing in many states.
Okay. Next question is, how should we modify, adjust our voter outreach and messaging strategy to promote vote by mail without potentially discouraging or disfranchising those voters who traditionally vote in person? It's clear that we still need to have an in-person voting available, but how do we both increase VBM participation to keep people safe while also offering in-person voting options for people who need it in person?
Okay, I think it's absolutely doable. I think given our circumstances, people are paying attention to the news a little bit more than we have in the past. So if there's ever a time to effectively educate voters about changes to how we're doing things, it's now, because for better and for worse, we have a little bit more of a captive attention of the voters. And I'm soberly optimistic because of the success that we've seen under the Voters' Choice Act, right? The same question has been asked county by county as they're moving from the old way of voting to the new way of voting, which is precise to this, expanded vote by mail, but preserving in-person options, and even the in-person options, changing it a little bit for the better. But it's not successful if voters aren't aware. And the evidence is there. In every county that has made that transition, overall turnout goes up, and amongst each subgroup that we can analyze, turnout goes up. So we feel good about what we need to do. Makes even more sense during this health pandemic.
Can I add one other thing? One of the things that gives me hope in this moment, as challenging as it all is, as an organization that has been working to pass reforms like online voter registration, same-day voter registration, vote by mail in both centers, expanding options for people to participate. It is now in the mainstream of conversation. People are focused on this. They're thinking about the possibilities and how it can help us in this healthcare crisis. The more people who can vote by mail that we drive to vote by mail create less long lines and dangers for people who vote in person. And as does early voting and other reforms that we can put in place to make voting safe and accessible for as many people as possible. So I am encouraged by the fact that this is in the mainstream of conversation now, and it creates a huge opportunity for us to move these kinds of reforms.
Right. And let me just add quickly, changes and the good, proper administration of these changes is one thing. Voter education is huge. We talked earlier about Wisconsin, and those images are blazed into my mind of the folks standing in line 6 feet apart, masks, etc., trying to stay safe on election day, only to come to learn that there's at least 7 cases of folks who contracted the virus that are directly traced back to their exercising their right to vote. 1 poll worker, 6 voters at a minimum. But even prior to that, for me, Exhibit A was Ohio. On the eve of their primary election, for there to be voter confusion as to whether or not there was going to be an election, and if so, how. Our democracy deserves better. The American people deserve better. And so, again, more than 6 months between now and November, we know the policies that work. We know what it takes. Where there's a will, there's a way. We need the resources, and voter education along the way will serve us all well in November.
I'll just add one quick thing as well. I think meeting voters where they're at is so important. So as states face this issue kind of en masse as a state as a whole, as much as we can do kind of coordinated messaging across the state is really important. Try to keep the messages simple as possible, shared amongst election officials and advocates. But still there is a reality that, as I mentioned earlier, the data tell us that voters are in different places in terms of their familiarity, the use rates of vote by mail, and the reasons, right? Different reasons for why many of them still have used in-person voting. And so when community groups are working at a more intimate level with their members, right, with the people that they work amongst, and they're outreaching to them, understanding where people are at, meeting them where they're at, addressing their concerns, walking them through, building trust around the changes. And the list could go on. Because of time, I'll just stop there. But I think just understanding where people are coming from and building that trust and confidence, and giving them the nuts and bolts of those changes, in addition to kind of why the changes are happening, so that they can feel comfortable in that, I think it's going to be really, really key.
The next questions, I'm going to put them together. Please address how the funding of the USPS may affect voting by mail. Since I don't really vote by mail, I'm not sure there is a way to track if your ballot has even been received. Would that be a way to help alleviate some of the distrust or fears using the USPS to get to your ballot? I appreciate being able to personally drop off my ballot thanks to the changes made by the Voters' Choice Act.
Great. If I can go first. First of all, thank you for voting. Thank you for choosing how you want to participate. And receiving the ballot by mail is one thing. Returning it by mail is your choice. Dropping it off in person, that's your choice, as long as the ballot's returned. That's the beauty of this policy framework that we have in California. Your question about the Postal Service, I don't want to forget. Look, current projections show the Post Service going bankrupt before the November election. So it is something that Congress needs to act on, to infuse resources to the Postal Service, because it's critical for the census, critical for the elections, critical for the economy. And there's already been threats by the Trump administration to not provide the Postal Service the resources they need. Is it political gamesmanship or whatnot? Who knows? But we know Congress needs to buttress the Postal Service over the next several months, because without Postal Service, there is no vote by mail. I'm forgetting the second question you had. I know you got the vote by mail ballot. You returned it in person. No return postage required in California. For all, the tracking of your ballot. Yes, it is available in most counties in California. You go to that vote.ca.gov website that I mentioned earlier, under the banner, Where's My Ballot? If you live in a participating county, there's a way to subscribe or sign up, and you choose if you want to get automated phone alerts, text messages, or email alerts of your ballot as it's coming to you. And as it's going back to the county, you'll get notified when the ballot is processed and when it's counted. So that does a tremendous amount of adding public confidence in vote by mail, both on the integrity side and participation side. And we're going to be calling for all counties to implement that for November.
And as a follow-up to that, another question that just popped in is, how will the vote by mail work when I'm currently self-isolating at a different location than my regular registered location where my parents live?
So again, go to vote.ca.gov. One of the options you have there is your voter registration information. You can update that. So you can still stay registered where you believe is home, but you can choose a different address for the ballot to be mailed to you, and handle it that way.
Can I just add one thing, which is there is going to be a battle around the next congressional stimulus package, the CARES Act 4, probably sometime in May. And funding for states for election infrastructure will be part of that, as will funding for the Postal Service. So those are interested in that can go to commoncause.org and learn more about that.
Okay, I'll try to get through a couple more questions before we end today's session. Will the presidential voting system ever be open to online voting?
I hope not.
Not anytime soon. There's been various types of attempts, pilots, to try to develop a secure online voting system. They've all been compromised. So unless or until technology can prove otherwise, no online voting. Paper ballots, paper ballots, paper ballots.
Regarding the last comment on opening polling places on campuses such as USC, what would be the best way for members of those campus communities to advocate for such use of space?
I think the best way to advocate for that is the way many student leaders and organizations have advocated for a polling place or a vote center on their campus. Both contact the county registrar of voters, or you can contact the Secretary of State's office at vote.ca.gov, but also contact the university administration or the college administrators and say, there's that desire, there's that demand on the campus. many of the vote centers in the Voters' Choice Act counties in 2018 were on UC campuses, CSU campuses, some privates, a lot of community colleges as well. And there's a way to design, whether the campus is open for students or closed, protocols to ensure everybody's public health and safety, all the PPE for voters and poll workers, the physical distancing, and everything else that's going to be required.
Yeah, and
Now,
US, oh, sorry.
We're going to say the same thing. USC served as the vote center as well in our LA campus, yeah. Proudly.
Another question. Could election day be turned into an election week or another extended period of time? If a moratorium was put in place around campaign activity and the results kept secret during the week, wouldn't this allow more time to conduct a safer election and encourage participation?
So, well, in some ways, we're already moving towards that. Half the voters of California live in a county that are under the Voters' Choice Act. And under the Voters' Choice Act, early voting sites, the vote centers open 11 days before election day. So it's 10 days of early voting plus election day, making it 11 days. May or may not be completely sustainable in November, but we're gonna make sure that there are multiple days. Again, it goes back to the venues, goes back to how many poll workers we can recruit, but there's already multiple days of voting options for voters in those counties if you didn't vote by mail to begin with. So it's not about a single day or a holiday, or why is election day not on a Saturday? If you spread it out over 4 days or 11 days, whatever it is, voters have the choice of which day works best for them, the location that works best for them, and that's if they didn't vote by mail to begin with.
And I'll just jump in. We are fortunate in California that we do have early voting available through the Voters' Choice Act, and in non-Voters' Choice Act counties. It's just different. Karen, we're almost at time now. Did you want to just say anything on that question, just from a national view?
There are many states that are moving vote by mail and early voting, and early voting does allow more people to vote so that we don't have the long lines. And in a COVID pandemic, our goal is to really shorten long lines for people's safety so that they can follow CDC guidelines and stand 6 feet apart, that there are materials for them to use, where it could be, marking devices that they have to cast their ballot, so that they are handed those out and they take them with them, so they're not sharing documents, sharing any devices, and also that there is sanitation materials for them to do that. So we see early voting as one of those things that can make in-person voting safer for people who do it.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. We're at time, 1:30. Thank you, Secretary Padilla, for joining us today, for the web link and being on top of it in the chat and looking through all the questions. We really appreciate that. You want to above and beyond the call of duty. And of course, Karen Hobart Flynn of Common Cause, thank you very much for joining us and giving us a national view from your perspective. My colleague, Dr. Christian Grose, thank you very much. Dean Jack Knott, thank you for joining us. And Harley, of course, for making all of this run today and for moderating our questions. To everyone that joined us, whether on Facebook Live or on the Zoom platform, we thank you very much. As a reminder, if you are registered, you will get a link to our webpage, the Price Talk webpage, that will give a recording of this that you can share, as well as a myriad of links to the research, and also to the Secretary of State's website and Common Cause's website as reference for everyone. Thank you all very much. Have a safe and healthy day, and happy Earth Day.
And I'll just add that we have another Price Talk tomorrow at 12:30, so we hope you'll tune in for that. Yes. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy Earth Day.